Okay, so Perek Dalet Mishnah Chof Aleph. It's the second last Mishnah, so we're getting towards the end of this chapter, fourth chapter, the 21st Mishnah. It is attributed to a rabbi called Rabbi Elazar HaKapar. Anybody know what that means? So that's Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler. Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler was the shoemaker. Elazar HaKapar, where did he get his name from? So he gets his name from the region he came from. He came from an area called Kafrisin. Okay? Now whether or not that is related to modern day Kafrisin, which is Cyprus, unlikely. But that's how he gets his name. In some places, he is called Rabbi Elazar Beribi, which implies that he was a very great rabbi. And he was one of the last of the Tanoim. So that means chronologically, we're now all the way towards the end of the period of the construction of the Mishnah. And so he was at the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, but even beyond that, he was at the time of Rabbi Chia. Now this is interesting, because Rabbi Chia is a very intriguing personality, even though this Mishnah is not about him. Just to give a little bit of context, Rabbi Chia, we're told, is the person who saved Judaism at the time in a certain respect, because he came up with a system to ensure that all the kids at school would get to learn all of the Mishnayos. The Mishnah was fresh, was brand new. So he created a system that everybody would review the Mishnah between them, and then he contributed later what is called the Tosefta. The Tosefta is kind of the additional conversations. It didn't quite make it into the final cut of the Mishnah. So this Rabbi Elazar we're learning about over here lives at the same time. He's a colleague of Rabbi Chia, and he's considered to be one of the great sages of the time. Now, what does he tell us? HaKapar. Beribi. It's not Ben, Beribi. So it's like a play on words. Beribi from the word like Rav, great, as opposed to Rav, rabbi. So Beribi the great, Rabbi Elazar the great, which is interesting because we already have Rabbi Elazar HaGadol previously in an earlier generation who was considered the great of his time. So what does he tell us? It's a short Mishnah, and you would anticipate that if it's a short Mishnah, we should be able to get through it pretty quickly. What does he say? Hakina v'hataiva v'hakavoit. Let's translate those. What's kina? Jealousy or envy. Taiva is lust, and kavoid is honor. So, envy, lust, and honor, motzina sa'adam min ha'olam. Those are the things that drive a person from the world. Now, before we go anywhere in this Mishnah, what? Sorry.
Is it honor or the quest?
So that's what we're going to explore, right? That's a great exactly. So the translations do that, right? They fill in for us from the Mefarshim, from the commentaries. But before we get there, before we ask any of these questions, before we analyze these three things and why these three things, I have two questions. Question one is, does anybody remember how the previous Mishnah ended? Because there very often is a flow from one Mishnah to the next. Question number two is, does this sound familiar? Hakina, Hataiva, V'hakavoid, which is basically three different traits or behaviors that drive a person from the world. Is there anything about that sounds familiar? Okay, so those are the two questions. What was the end of the previous Mishnah? And is there anything that sounds familiar in this statement? Is there anything that comes to mind? So let's start first. How did the previous Mishnah end? The what? Correct. Rabbi Meir says, Al tistakel b'kankan, don't look at the vessel, the container, ela b'mashi yesh boi, rather examine what its contents are. So in other words, don't judge a book by its cover, to use the colloquial version. Okay? So that's how the Mishnah ended. You've got to try to work out what's the link. How do you go from that conversation about not judging things by externalities to this conversation, which is that there are three kinds of behavior or attitudes or traits that drive a person from the world? That's our first question that we're going to examine. Second question we're going to examine is, does this sound familiar? So does anything about it sound familiar?
Does it correlate to the three things that the world exists on?
Okay, that's an interesting perspective, because you're going to say three things that destroy the world must relate to three things that sustain the world. So possibly But that wouldn't be the part that sounds familiar. That would be a link, right? What sounds familiar? Anything sound familiar?
Yes, it's at the end of chapter 1, I think.
Yes.
And it says, what keeps the world going?
Oh, so that's the same point, right? Three things that sustain the world compared to three things that destroy the world. But I'm asking a slightly different question over here. Is there anything that sounds familiar about three things that drive us from this world?
Yes, if you get angry,
Okay.
if you drink,
Right?
and if you want your own rights.
And where did we learn that?
I'm not sure.
So that's so those are valid statements, but they're not from Pirkei Avos, so they're not familiar. But what have we learned in Pirkei Avos about things that drive us from this world? We have learned things that drive us from this world already. Anybody remember? Ayin hora. Does anybody remember this? We learned the Mishnah. Ayin hora, that to have an evil eye. I think it was Rabbi Yeshua who said it, if I'm not mistaken. Yetzer hora, a bad inclination. V'sinas habriyos, and hatred of other people. Motzienesa adam min ha'olam. Those are things that drive us from the world. So now make up your mind. Which three is it? Is it that list of three? Or is it this list of three? What exactly drives a person from this world? Oh, and the plot thickens. The plot thickens because you may remember another Mishnah. Another Mishnah that said, Yayin shel tzaharayim, that if a person drinks during the course of the day, and Shena shel shachris, sleeping late in the morning, Yayin shel tzaharayim, having a l'chaim in the afternoon, v'sichas hayeladim, and children's prattle. Those are things that motzinas ha'adam min ha'olam, that drive a person from this world. So now we've got three possibilities. Hanging out and talking with children, basically. Children's prattle.
Is that also
Right?
Pirkei Avos?
Also Pirkei Avos. So now which one is it? It sounds like there's a little bit of a debate running here between the rabbis. What are the three most destructive behaviors that could drive a person from this world? Okay? Interesting. So let's try and understand what's going on over here. Now before we do that, before we can understand any of it, let's try and understand what do we mean when we say kina, taiva, and kavod. What are the three things? Because it's one concept to translate them, and it's something entirely different if we want to try and analyze them. So let's start. What is kina? What is envy? What is envy? Where does it come from? How does it manifest? Is it a bad thing? Is it sometimes bad? Like, what's the reality of kina? Of envy? Is what?
Resenting someone else.
Resenting someone else what they have. Okay? Okay, that's one point. Well, I didn't hear what were you saying?
I was saying it's good if you have that jealousy of somebody who's learning a lot of Torah.
Okay, so it could be positive. If it's, let's say that a person is envious of somebody else who's learning more or doing more, then it could be a positive thing. It could be motivating, right? It's got to be like them. Okay, fine, fair enough. So the principle of kina. What is the principle of kina? Someone has what I don't have.
Coveting.
Right? Okay, coveting might be different. Lois sachmoid is coveting, and this is kina. Different words, it could be a little different. So what's kina? Kina is envy. Now, what's interesting about envy is, or what's interesting about human psychology, is when you ask people, what are the most famous, most popular topics that you can always get somebody to come to listen to a lecture about? Let's try construct. I'm looking for ideas anyway. So what are the most popular topics? Is what? Marriage, right? Marriage, and what's the other one? Parenting, right? What do you say? Anxiety, and all the various subcategories of anxiety. What's the one you haven't yet got the most popular topic of all time? Is what?
What we're doing right now.
No, I wish. Is what? Why bad things happen to good people, right? So usually those are the two most popular topics. Marriage and why do bad things happen to good people? And that does make you wonder. So but the reason I mention it is Because what bothers people more than why bad things happen to good people is why do good things happen to bad people. That's really what bothers everybody, right? Why do good things happen to bad people? So they say that Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, who was a tremendous Torah scholar, that he would say, it's interesting, if somebody comes to the rabbi and asks a shaila, so let's say a person comes to the rabbi and says, is this particular thing kosher or non-kosher? Classical shaila, right? So I made this mess up in the kitchen. You go to the rabbi and you ask, is it kosher or is it non-kosher? Can I keep the food or do I have to throw it out? Do I have to kasher the dish or don't have to kasher the dish? Or in those days, can I take the chicken home or do I have to discard the chicken? So the rabbi gives the psak and the person accepts it. And that's how it is. Thank you, rabbi. Now I know. Yet, when the same person comes to the same rabbi having a financial dispute with somebody else, and the rabbi rules, actually you have to pay that other person money, then the person says, are you sure, rabbi? Okay, maybe there's some information you didn't realize about the case, and the person argues. So Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz says, why? Why is it that somebody is so willing to accept the rabbi's authority with regards to kashrus and not necessarily with regards to business? You know what he says? Because it is easier for a person to accept that they will lose out. Let's say the person has to now discard the chicken or throw out the food. So there's a financial loss. The person can accept that. It's much easier to accept one's own financial loss than somebody else's financial gain. How's that for a thought? So the fact that I have to pay is half a tzorah. The fact that somebody else is getting the money that I have to pay, that's what bothers me. So what's kina? Kina is this discomfort that a person has in the fact that somebody else has something that I believe I should have. That's what kina is. Now that's an incredible psychology, right? Number one, it's a black hole psychology. If a person lives with the headspace of kina, it can never be satisfied. It can never be satisfied. Because every time you think okay, so now I'll get what the other person has, if that's the psychology that a person lives with, no sooner do they have it, they discover something else that they're envious of. And it becomes this never-ending cycle, this destructive cycle. It literally drives a person from the world. Depression, anxiety, jealousy, or crime. Because if a person has the attitude of kina, and they can't control it, and they can't contextualize it, they don't necessarily know how to stop the behaviors it will produce. So kina produces behaviors that are illegal. Because if a person is so envious of somebody else, they may steal, cheat, lie, or God forbid worse. We'll take a look at that shortly. We're going to come back to it. We're going to look at an example. Okay, so what's the psychology of kina? The psychology of envy is a person cannot tolerate the fact that somebody else has what I wish I had. What is taiva? What's lust? You see the difference now. They look similar, but they're really different. Lust has nothing to do with anybody else. It's not envy. It's not about the fact that somebody else has this particular item, that success, that happiness, or whatever. Lust is a desire that the person says, I want for me. Something that will give me pleasure. So lust is always associated with pleasure. Taiva, if a person lives their life chasing pleasure, it's very similar to kina. It's never ending. What does the Gemara tell us? Misha yeshloi mone roitze mosayim. The nature of people is that if you have 100 in your account, that is the day you wish for 200. And as soon as you get 200, Misha yeshlo mosayim roitze arba meos. The day that you reach 200 in the account is the day that you start to wish for 400. It's incredible, right? If a person lives in the world of taiva, in the world of lust, it can never be satisfied. That's human psychology. If that's my value set, if that's what I care about, if that's what I want, there'll always be something bigger and better. So that's why, for example, you've got this whole major industry of, let's say, cell phones. What do? They keep telling you why the one you just got is not as good as the one you should be getting. That's how they do it. That's how they sell it. And that's why people walk through. The whole concept of walking through a shopping mall is based on the principle of taiva. Nobody walks through a shopping mall focused only and solely on what I need. It's let me just see what there is. And that's what we do. So it fills this taiva cycle. It's really interesting. I was talking to somebody over Shabbos, and they've just packed up their house to downsize.
Yes,
It's a fascinating exercise, right?
very,
To downsize.
very.
It's a fascinating exercise because you have to confront what you need versus what you want. It's a fascinating. It's almost like something we should all do on a regular basis. Some people do at Pesach time, right? we somehow go from cleaning for chometz to reorganizing our lives, as is mandated by the Torah, obviously, right? That before Pesach you should create additional stress. But it's an interesting concept, right? The idea of downsizing your life. You know, one of the most profound things that we saw when I went on this Poland trip, whatever it was, 2 months ago, was when you go through the section in Auschwitz, they have all the suitcases. And you just look at those suitcases and realize what kind of a terrible dilemma it had to have been for people to pack up their whole life into a single suitcase, because it was literally whatever you could carry, that's what you could take. So they show you this section with all these suitcases, which obviously is just a fraction of what came through. You know, but it's this massive room full of suitcases. And then you go to the next rooms of exhibits, and you see talesim. And you see there's a section of pots and pans, and they're all either red or blue, you know, clearly indicated milchik and fleshik. And at that point, when we're at the talesim, our guide turns to us and he says, you realize at this point that Jews pack differently. And it was a very profound insight. When you have to totally skin it down to the core of what we are, we would take Shabbos candles, we would take a talis and tefillin, we would take the kosher pots, as opposed to other things that other refugees would take when they were on the move. So taiva is the opposite. Taiva is where a person can never fulfill all of the desires because the desires precipitate and they just grow. What is kavod? Kavod is the pursuit of kavod, right? It's the pursuit of honor. It's the same fundamental mentality that runs through all three of them. I need more honor. That's the attitude of kavod. I need more honor. Like the person who's envious that I need what somebody else has, or the person who has taiva, lusts for things that they believe they need in order to feel good, because lust is always for experiential things. It's going to make me feel good, it tastes good, it looks good, it's a nice experience, a pleasurable experience. Kavod is the person who says, I deserve more honor. Okay? So now, these three attitudes are a little different and yet somewhat similar to the other sets of three that we've already read about. The first one, which we're going to look at, is sleeping late, drinking in the afternoons, and hanging out, speaking only to children. Those are things that drive a person from this world. They're unhealthy behaviors. That's the reality. They're just unhealthy behaviors. No one's ever going to be productive if they sleep late, they drink in the afternoon, and they hang out with children all day. You can't exactly, and we're not talking about mothers, obviously, even though mothers may well be driven to drink in the afternoon. That's,
Doesn't that mean more doing irrelevant things?
correct.
It's not
Correct. Being unproductive.
Children.
Being unproductive,
Yeah,
right?
it's
So
irrelevant
we understand that that's the kind of thing that's going to drive a person from this world. You cannot be a citizen of this world and spend the whole day doing things that actually have no meaning. Fine, we get that. The other Mishnah is a person who has an ayin hora, a negative eye, yetzer hora, who follows their temptations. And sinas habrios, hates people. That would drive a person from the next world. That would destroy a person's spirituality completely. This Mishnah describes the kind of thing that destroys both. Hakina, v'hataiva, v'hakavoid. These are the things that damage us in the here and now and in the long term, in the physical and in the spiritual. And there is a correlation between this Mishnah and the one about the Ayin Hara, the Yetzer Hara, and hatred of other people, which is actually quite obvious when you think about it. What's an Ayin Hara? An Ayin Hara isn't when you go buy the voodoo doll and you start sticking pins. An Ayin Hara is a person who looks with a negative attitude towards somebody else's success and therefore generates a negative energy. It's part and parcel of the reality of kina, of envy. Yetzer hara is the inclination that a person has to chase their lustful temptations. So that fits with taiva. And sinas habrios, hatred for other people, is associated with kavod because the person who feels that they deserve honor, if they don't get it, then they start to resent the people who don't give them the honor that they believe that they should have. We'll get there in a second. Okay, we're going to get there in a second. Very good observation. However, before we get to that point, before we get to Korach, we're going to learn a fascinating principle about life. It is a foundational principle about life. And it all boils down to one core thought process. Do we believe in Hashem or not? Now, okay, everybody's going to say we believe in Hashem. Obviously we believe in Hashem. Who doesn't believe in Hashem? Obviously. But what does that mean? You know, the Gemara talks about a scenario, it's called Ganva Apum Machtarta Rachmona Karya. It's a fascinating psychology that makes you chuckle when you hear it until you think about it and you say, oops, maybe I do that too. Ganva Apum Machtarta means the Ganav, as he's tunneling into the house that he intends to burgle, Rachmana Karya, he says a little prayer for success. Please God, let me not be caught. Right? Now you have to ask yourself a question. Does the Ganav believe in God or not? It's a good question, right? And we have an expression we use in Gemara language, it's called Mimon Nafshach, which means whichever way you look at it, it doesn't make sense. It's a complete paradox. If the person doesn't believe in God and therefore is willing to ignore loy signoiv or loy sigzol, whichever particular kind of robbery or theft he's planning, so then why pray? You don't believe in God, why are you praying? You're rejecting one of the core principles of Torah, why are you davening? So, because what?
People are complex, so they don't believe.
People are paradoxical, right? Not just complex, paradoxically complex. So what happens? So in other words, the fact that the person prays means that they do believe in God. So if they do believe in God, why are they stealing? Because God helps those who help themselves, right? So why does the person daven? Because that is the reality that every single one of us faces, whether we are willing to acknowledge it or not. Our belief in Hashem goes so deep and no deeper. It's a challenge. Every one of us has a level of depth to which our belief goes. The Ganav believes that Hashem could protect them from being caught, but the faith doesn't go deep enough to believe that Hashem will provide for them if they just do things morally and appropriately. So the core principle of Judaism is, if I believe in God, that means I believe not just in God, the creator of heaven and earth, which is kind of easy to believe in, and kind of easy to be criminal believing in. I have to believe that God is the creator of my exact, precise circumstances in this moment. That's emunah. That God is the creator of my precise circumstances in this moment. So that's emunah. Okay? Let's understand what that means. There's a principle that Chazal teach us, that it is impossible for any person to take away the parnasa of another person. It's impossible. Now, you know what's great about that teaching? You know what's great about it? Rabbis love to tell it to people in their communities. Don't stress. Hashem's got it all worked out. You could have your business. Somebody else could have a competing business half a block away. Nobody ein adam nogea b'parnasaso shel chaveroi. Nobody has the power to touch somebody else's allocated parnasa. On Rosh Hashanah, Hashem decided that's how much you're getting. That's how much you're getting. There could be a recession. There could be COVID. There could be competitors on your doorstep. It makes no difference. You have to put in your hishtadlus. You put in your effort, and Hashem will guarantee the rest. That's it. No stress, no anxiety. Rabbis love to tell this to their community. What is the irony of the story? Rabbis forget that it applies to rabbis too. Nobody can take your people. Just like nobody can take their parnasa, nobody can take your people. So if somebody can open a shul half a block away from you, it's God's business. If Hashem wanted these people to belong to your community, you could have 15 shuls on your doorstep. It's not going to make a difference. So you see, we've all got a layer after or beyond which our emunah starts to falter. What is kina? What is envy? Envy is not a matter of, oh, that person has something, I wish I had it. Envy is a rejection of our belief that Hashem allocates everybody precisely what they should have. No more and no less. So the person who has kina is effectively arguing against Hashem's supreme decisions. Why am I envious of that person? Why do I wish that I could have what they have? Because in my mind, God got it wrong. He gave that person something he should have given to me. If he would have given it to me, you know how well I would have used it. That's like the lottery argument, you know, the famous lot. Hashem, if you make me win the lottery, I will give so much tzedakah. I think Hashem didn't know this. I'm going to bargain with him. Here's my list of charitable recipients. You know, just give me the lotto. It doesn't work that way. We have to do our part. We have to create the environment for Hashem's brachas. And then we have to have absolute trust that what Hashem allocates to us is what we deserve. Nothing more, nothing less. So to live with an attitude of kina that believes that somebody else has something that I should have, is one of the ways that a person totally drives themselves out of the world because they're not living aligned with how Hashem wants us to live, with absolute acceptance of His authority, His wisdom, and His choices. Where was the first time in history that ever happened? That a person got that wrong? Okay? Eitz Hadas. What happened with the Eitz Hadas? Hashem tells Adam and Chava, here are all the trees you could possibly imagine with every kind of fruit, including those that have not yet been genetically engineered. Okay? Because we know at that time in history, even trees that today don't have fruit, then had fruit. So the offering was unbelievable. It was greater than a breakfast in a Jerusalem hotel. Here you can have whatever you want. Just not that one. What's the first thing that happens to Adam and Chava? Is an element of kina. I'm envious about the one that I can't have. Instead of living with everything that I can have, what I start to think about, that which I can't have. So that was the first step to the Chet Eitz Hadas, and the Torah alludes to it because the Torah describes the tree. Anybody remember how the Torah describes the tree? They saw that the tree ki toiv ha'etz lamachol. It was a tree that had fruit that is good to eat. V'chisavehu lo'einayim. And it was appealing to the eye. V'nechmad ha'etz lahaskil. And it was beautiful to, and it's a strange word. How do you translate lahaskil? To comprehend. When do you comprehend trees? That pasuk is referring to these three things. Kina, taiva, and kavod. It's talking to the core psychology of why it is that people get mixed up in places and experiences that they should not. It's kina, taiva, and kavod. It's that which tastes good, looks good, or sounds good in my head. Those are the reasons that people unravel themselves. Motzian es adam min ha'olam. Those are the things that drive a person out of this world. And each of them relates to a different reason or motivation why we might reject what Hashem has allocated for us. The parameters of life that Hashem has created. The first one is envy, kina. I believe that I should have something else that Hashem hasn't yet given me. That's where the Eitz Hadas begins. I believe I should have that fruit that Hashem has not allocated to me. Now, what happens when a person engages in this behavior? What happened after the Eitz Hadas? Death. Death was introduced to the world, and they were removed from Gan Eden. You see that it drives a person from the physical reality of life and from the spiritual experience of Gan Eden, as we've seen, right? This is where both elements could be destroyed by a person's choices. Both the physical and the spiritual life could be harmed by a person's choices. What is the first factor that destroys a person's life? Kina, the unwillingness to accept that what Hashem has not allocated for me, that means it has no value to me. It has no part to play in my life. It will add nothing to my life. I have to accept that it's allocated to somebody else. It belongs to them, and I should be at peace with that. Now, because Adam and Chava engaged in an act that was motivated by that temptation of jealousy, of envy, they landed up with a child who was driven by a blinding sense of envy. And who was he? Now we get to that point. Who was that child? Cain. Listen to the word. Cain is related to the word kina. It's no accident. That's his name because that's his biggest challenge in life. He doesn't know how to contain envy. So what happens with Cain? It's a fascinating story. Cain's story begins with good motivation, with good intentions. Let's bring an offering to Hashem. It's a great thing to do. He's the initiator of bringing a thanksgiving or a praise offering to Hashem, whatever it is. He initiates. He should be the happiest person on earth. I am somebody who came up with a way to connect to Hashem. He should feel great. But he looks over his shoulder and he sees that his brother has done the same thing and he's gotten more attention from Hashem. Now there is the envy. What's he envious of? He's getting more attention than I'm getting. Okay? So go back to the teaching of Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. What happens? I don't mind the fact that I've lost out as much as the fact that he's gained. In other words, Cain at that point in time, his first response should have been, let me upgrade my offering so that I can get that attention. In other words, it is possible for kina to be a positive force. It can happen. We have a principle called kinas soifrim tarbe chochma. That when there is envy between scholars, the competition between them causes an increase in Torah learning, both between them themselves and to the benefit of everybody else, because the competition drives teaching. So you now get to choose. Kina doesn't have to be bad. It could be a positive thing. You could transform it. You could have this kina that says, let me do more. Instead, what does he do? He wants to destroy his brother. In this case, he drives another person from the world. And that's the danger of envy. The danger of envy is that it could destroy other people. In that case, it was very literal, that he actually killed him. But in not as dramatic circumstances, it could be that we drive a person out of our lives. It can happen because we're so envious of them. Or we destroy people, God forbid, because of envy. So that's the story of Adam and Chava's kina translating into Cain and his burning envy of his brother. But it wasn't only kina, because that's the part, you're looking with your eyes at what the other person has and saying, I want what that person has. But prior to that, we say that the tree was toiv ha'etz lamachol. They knew it was going to taste good. That's taiva. The world of taiva is, how much pleasure will this give me? I want things that are going to give me pleasure. And it's the same principle. Taiva means that a person has a desire for things that Hashem says you shouldn't be having. Shouldn't be having these things. It's the same acceptance. The same acceptance that Hashem says, keep within certain realms, not only the realms of what's kosher and non-kosher, but even the realms of what is kosher. The concept of a ben sorer u'moire, the so-called rebellious child, this very weird scenario in Judaism. What's his big problem? Where does it all start? Starts with zoilo v'soive, person who cannot control their own temptation, doesn't know how to stop, doesn't know how to say no to an inappropriate pleasure. That's taiva. Not accepting that Hashem created parameters and boundaries, that we're supposed to actually guard our own pleasures. That's why the Torah has so many laws. Right now, for those of us who follow the annual cycle of studying Mishnah Torah, so you learn 3 chapters of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah every day. So we're currently in the Sefer Kedusha. Sefer Kedusha focuses on 2 sets of laws. Laws against promiscuous relations and laws against foods that we may not eat. The Rambam introduces that section by saying that there are 2 ways in which Hashem made us His holy people. Right? Kedusha, it's the section of holiness. The 2 ways that Hashem made us His holy people: by limiting the relations that we could have and the foods that we could eat. Meaning to say, by limiting taiva, by limiting those things that everybody else in the rest of the world draws pleasure from, that's where Kedusha comes from. If a person doesn't have those boundaries, if a person won't respect those boundaries, then they don't acknowledge that Hashem says, this is where Kedusha comes from. And now, if you want to go down another path, so part of what attracted Adam and Chava to the tree was the fact that there was pleasure associated with the tree. And they wanted to enjoy that pleasure. As a result of that, they landed up with a son whose biggest challenge in life was pleasure. Who's that? Cain was the one whose challenge was envy. Who's the one whose challenge is taiva? Hevel. What's the connection? Hevel havolim akoil hovel. How does Koheles begin? That it is all hevel, it is all emptiness, it's all vanity. What's he referring to in the beginning of Koheles? The pleasures of this world. It's all hevel, it's all meaningless. That's why, ironically, Hevel, yes, Hevel is amazing, because he brings all these beautiful animals as his offering to Hashem, rather than just the scrawny produce that Cain brought. But why did Hevel bring such beautiful fat animals to Hashem? Because in his world, that's what you want in life. The tasty, the fat, the good of this world. Now, not God forbid to say that Hevel was a bad person, but he was tainted by this drive for taiva, and that colored his understanding of what Hashem wants. Hashem wants, and in fact there's a pasuk that says it, Kol chelev LaHashem, that we have to give the best of everything to Hashem. In his mind, you can only designate something for Hashem if it is pleasurable. Unfortunately, he lost his opportunity to live in this world because dedication to Hashem is not based on taiva. It's not based on what feels good or what we enjoy. It's based on dedication to Hashem, which sometimes is not so enjoyable. So that's, so to speak, the end of the line for Hevel. Taiva, the person who just wishes to enjoy themselves beyond the parameters that Hashem has given. So now people are complex, as we know. And people are often driven by very hedonistic tendencies. So that's taiva. Sometimes we are driven by very emotional tendencies. So that's kina. And sometimes we are driven by intellectual tendencies. And that's kavod. And you know what? Intellectual shift is sometimes the most difficult to identify and therefore the most difficult to achieve. If a person is a complete hedonist, you know, like the joke. I remember once when I was in yeshiva, and this was in the days before MasterChef. So now the parable, the mashal is much stronger now. So I remember in yeshiva once there was a rabbi who said, if you had 2 people sitting at a table, one was a homeless person who pulled off the side of the road, and you put in front of them a steak, a beautiful, tender steak, and whatever vegetables you put. And the person digs in, you know, with their hands, and they're licking their lips, and the food is going everywhere. You would say, what? Disgusting. It's not how you're supposed to behave. And you didn't naturally think that this person is a lowly person. At the next table, you bring in some connoisseur, some food critic, who sits there, daintily taking a little piece of something, swishing it around in their mouth, and then telling you about the infusions and the hints of this and a thing of that and whatever the case is. And you'll say, oh, sophisticated. So this rabbi said, you got it all wrong. It's a natural thing for a person who hasn't had food to go crazy when they have good food. It's natural. It's normal. It's human nature. It's not a natural thing for a person who has the gift of intellect to make their whole intellect purely about which infusion is in this food. The world of intellect is a much more subtle world. And because it's more subtle, it's more difficult to identify where the problems lie, and therefore it is more difficult to correct the problems when they manifest. Right? When a person is a hedonist, and the person's sitting there stuffing themselves and drinking in the middle of the day, you can turn around to them and say, stop being a behemoth, fix up your life, and become a mensch. And it's difficult for them to say, I'm not a behemoth, because they look like a behemoth, they sound like a behemoth, they behave like a behemoth. When a person has this whole sophisticated intellectual argument for why they need to behave in a particular way, then how are you supposed to counter that without sounding like you yourself are either an extremist or a meshugana or from the old days? It's difficult, right? It's probably the greatest challenge of living in the 21st century. Is everybody's got these grand philosophies that they've created to defend their behaviors, and when we say, hey, there's another perspective, they say, you're from the Dark Ages. Kavod is one of the most difficult things to balance and to quantify. If somebody's envious, you say, get over yourself, stop being jealous that somebody else says something. If somebody has a taiva, you can say, self-control. But if a person truly believes that they are scholarly, respectable, or whatever the case is, what are you going to say to them? No, you're not. You don't deserve respect. Maybe they do deserve the honor. And it's not even an issue of whether objectively they're right or wrong. It's just that they become obsessed with the honor. What is the fundamental flaw of the person who pursues kavod? They don't trust that if Hashem gives me this group of people, that gives me this kind of kavod, that's what I deserve. And I shouldn't be thinking, no, I need more. It's the same fundamental principle. The emunah doesn't get into that subtle part of their mind to say, I'm where I need to be. I have the kavod that I need to have. I don't have to put myself onto a pedestal. Nechmad ha'etz lahaskil. That's where a person has this whole intellectual argument why I deserve the fruit of that tree. You know who I am? I'm Adam Harishon. I'm the very first human. I've got to take control of this world. Hashem gave me a responsibility. What do you mean there's a section of the world I can't touch? How's that going to work? So this elaborate intellectual rationalization, why I should be eating from the tree. What do you think it's for me? You think it's because I need the kavod? No, I represent the Torah. The Torah needs the kavod. So now kavod, honor, is something that you never get to choose. It's completely outside of our hands. Down the line, after Adam and Chava go through being removed from Gan Eden and having to have an experience of Teshuvah, they were given a third son. And there the Torah is very clear, Shosli Elokim Zera Acher, as Chava says. Hashem has given me another son. I didn't do it. I didn't achieve it. Hashem gifted me. That's what kavod is. Real kavod, real honor, honest kavod, is to acknowledge it's what comes to me from others and I have zero control over it. Hashem will decide whether or not I should be given that kind of honor. What's interesting about this is that it relates to the previous Mishnah, but it also relates to the first Mishnah. We're at the end of the chapter. This takes us right back to the beginning of the chapter when Ben Zoma told us that there are various character traits that a person should aspire to. One of them is who is wealthy, the person who is happy with their lot. That's the opposite of kina. Who is powerful, the person who can control the Yetzer Hara. That is the opposite of taiva. Who is honored, the person who can honor others. That is the opposite of the person who seeks kavod. So the beginning and the end of this parak effectively tell us how to balance our character so that we don't run off and become some kind of a self-destructive human being. And that links to the previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah said, never judge things by appearance, only judge by content. Now it makes perfect sense. Why would a person be envious of somebody else? Because they're only looking at the kan-kan. They're only looking at how things present themselves. How things present. I don't believe that that person deserves that. Well, nobody asked us. We have to, if Hashem, we've got to switch our way of thinking. Rather than saying, how did Hashem give X to that person? Because we're looking at the kan-kan, the outside. We have to be looking, Mashe Yesh Boy. What does Hashem see in that person that I haven't seen? That obviously is the reason they deserve what they have in their life, that I am blind to. So I've got to look beyond the appearance. Al tistakel ba'kankan. If I look at something and say, I would love to have that because it looks so pleasurable, don't look at how it appears. Yes, it appears, and it will taste good, it will feel good, it will sound good. But look, Mashe Yesh Boy, does it have value? Does it actually have value? Or is it just something that's going to give me a transient experience of pleasure? And kavod, if I don't recognize that I should be giving kavod to other people and instead feel that they should all be giving kavod to me, al tistakel ba'kankan. Don't look at people and say, well, as far as I'm concerned, they're less than I am. They're people who should be learning from me. They're people who haven't achieved the kind of things that I've achieved. And therefore they should respect me. And of Mashe Yesh, boy, you have to look for a way to see the good in them, that they deserve your respect, and not necessarily the other way around. So there's a lot to work on in this Mishnah, as you can see. But it's very, very fundamental, right? Very fundamental set of teachings. Yes.